hollow day to those who have no God.
I can't sing it by myself hardly.
Sweet morning, sweet morning, and we'll all shout together in that morning.
The old man was one of the first Oklahomans, but we have never seen the looking glass of his mind. His history has always been there, but we have never looked through the looking glass darkly.
I thought Oklahoma was the beautifulest place I ever saw in the spring.
Oh, look at yonder girl, that's some Indians. And all the cowboys were colored.
That's Reed. I can tell you more about him than perhaps you ever heard.
He wasn't too good with a rope.
I'm one of the men that made General Lee surrender.
They did everything to make you feel that you were something else than a human.
We had to live, that's right, we had to put up with it.
When Andrew Jackson had all the Indians on that trail of tears, whether the history books show it or not, a great percentage of those people were black people.
I can remember when before they ever drove the Indians out on across the Mississippi River. That was an all, them Indians had an awful time. I got my mother and them talking about it. I was, a boy about 7, 8 years old. They beat them, they shot them, they killed them, they just murdered them all kinds of ways. And run them on back across the Mississippi River, back over in Oklahoma. And this wasn't fitting for nothing else, and they just decided to let them have. They give them this and never bother them about it anymore. The treaty was, as long as oak and ash grow, and as long as water run down the stream, that they would never be bothered about this country. Hide the night, oh Lord, hide the night.
No one knows for sure how many blacks came on the Trail of Tears. Census takers in those days didn't bother to knock on doors, and runaway slaves weren't answering any roll calls.
A whole lot of the colored, you see, you really know. And the Indians smuggled them in there. That they would help them out. All of them down that Mississippi River was just a dark swamp. And they could never get them out of there. They stayed in there. They would go back, skip at night, and go back on little masters and them farms and kill hogs and cut it all up and go on the way back and start a song. Said, way back, I'm gonna make it to my shanty, way back. The dogs on my truck and the chickens on my back, but I'm gonna make it to my shanty way back. They would get turpentine and put all under the bottom of the feet to keep the dogs from tracking them. The paddle rollers would come out with the hounds and go out and run them in the woods and run them and probably catch a whole lot of them. Every time they caught a slave, they got $700 for that slave. That's the way they personally made their living.
Oh, I'd rather be fishing for Brimmy and the creek and working in the sun out here all week. For specs to get ahead, Lord, specs to get ahead. I got to keep on.
Not all of the slaves were runaways. Some of the tribes in the South had plantations of their own. A black back was the going thing in a cotton field, no matter what color the owner happened to be. But ironically, it was this association that set the lifestyle in Indian Territory for more than 100 years.
I got to do it now. I got to do it now. I got to do what I'm doing.
All of them people from northern Georgia, Tennessee, and all that, when they were moved out, they carried their slaves with them. And their slaves were the ones that taught them agriculture, house building, and how to make a living other than fishing or hunting, because that was the Indians' tradition, just fishing and hunting. But now that was the salvation of Oklahoma, and that's the reason why it got to be known as 5 civilized tribes. These people live like civilized people.
Some of those blacks, of course, married into the Indian family. That's why there's so many black Indians, Creek and Seminole Indians.
And many of the Indians that ranked way high were black people. Most people don't know that Osceola, the chief of the Seminoles down there, was a half Negro. His mother was a Negro woman, but his father was a chief. Look at Jim Simmons over there if you want to. There, he's about 2/3 Indian, but on the rolls, he's a freedman. All right. Look at Reverend Davis here. He's about a quarter breed, but on the rolls, he's a black man. Look at me. I'm a quarter breed, Cherokee, but the rolls say I'm a Negro.
If you commit murder, you're just subject to be tried for murder and convicted for murder and be shot at sunrise. That's what my old stepdaddy would say. You've had your trial. I've heard him say that. You've had the jurors, you have an attorney, you've had your witnesses. The jurors have found you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I set your execution at sunrise next Thursday morning. That settles it. The laws were written by the Indian and Negro legislation. You see, to commit a crime was something awful. And whoever did it, he wouldn't like it because it'd be remembered forever. And they would announce it all around, he's going to whip a certain man on a certain day for committing an offense. And the people would come from far and near. There wasn't no certain whip to be beaten with. The officer would go to the nearest wood and cut down a limb, trim it up nicely, bring in 2 or 3 of them. There was a whipping that day. And if he was caught again, there was 100 lashes on the same back by 2 officers. That's right. One 50 lash and the other 50 lash. One man that counting that they wouldn't be missed or given too many. Well, now, the 3rd offense, if you're caught again, that's right. And the 3rd offense was death. That person would suffer death. There's no bond, no reprieve, no renewal, vacation, nothing of the kind. They had no chamber of death. They didn't hang by rope. They had a block they set up. They would set the prisoner on there, tie a white cloth across his chest about where his heart was. 2 officers would take a rifle and step off according to the presiding officer. 30 feet, 30 yards or something like that, and then turn at his command. I've seen that right at the old Lee Courthouse.
For 61 years, Oklahoma was primarily a land of the red and the black. A checkerboard, torn apart only by the endless autumn of the Civil War and its grim harvest. The Choctaws and the Chickasaws went with the South. The other tribes split. Black men fled north when they could.
The Battle of Honey Springs was the first real test they had as to whether Negro soldiers would fight or not. Practically all of the soldiers who fought at Honey Springs, they trained them up in Kansas and then moved them from Kansas down to Fort Gibson. And the principal group were mostly all black soldiers. all of these rangers from Texas and all, they knew that the Negro soldiers were at Fort Gibson. And they thought they knew they wouldn't fight. But they marched all night long, and that's what they caught them by surprise. They didn't think that the soldiers were going to march all night long. They were expecting them, but not that early. They left from Fort Gibson. They crossed the river over there on barges and marched down, right on down through part of Muskogee, right down by Chimney Mountain. And the Confederate soldiers that came on up brought wagon loads of handcuffs. And the purpose was they were going to take them, they were going to handcuff all of these Negro soldiers because they knew they wasn't going to fight anyhow, and they could just round them up like a bunch of cattle and handcuff them and take them back. They were going to march them back in handcuffs. And they were running there, let's go get them and capture them, figure they were going to capture all of them. And that is when the colonel said, now, and stood up. They tell me he got shot, but not killed there. He got it now. And all of those Negro soldiers raised up, and all those fellows were exposed. Prior to that, they'd been, bushwhacking and hiding. They come running on a charge and just slaughtered them down. And then he said, charge. And said those Negro soldiers went wild. These people not only would fight, but they fought effectively. And I guess some of them said they fought outrageously. But that established that the Negro soldier would fight. And from that time on, the War Department began enlisting them as regular, and prior to that, they was enlisting them only as servants. But they started enlisting them then as fighting men.
As always in the aftermath of war, thousands were set adrift by peace. This time, many were black. For most, the only home had been Army issue. Now that it was gone, there was no other, so they headed west. A savage tide was brewing in Oklahoma, and it would fall to the black man to cool the kettle. During the war, troops had been removed from the western edge of Indian Territory, and now Plains Indians were raiding the herds of the Chickasaws and the Choctaws. Bootleggers and horse thieves were entering illegally, and approaching white settlement was melting Oklahoma into a warpath. Some of the black men were asked to keep their uniforms. Congress was forming 6 black regiments. 2 were to be stationed in Oklahoma. General George Armstrong Custer was asked to command one of those regiments, but he refused, and in so doing set his path to the Little Bighorn 10 years later. Officially, those who came to Oklahoma were known as the 9th and 10th Cavalry, but to those who knew them best, the Cheyenne, Comanche, and Kiowa, they will always be remembered as the Buffalo Soldier. To the Indians, the black man's nappy hair resembled buffalo hide, and the name, a mixture of fear and respect, stuck. For 20 tempestuous years, the Buffalo Soldiers protected Indians from Indians and whites from renegades, and themselves from both. They were the law in western Oklahoma. Much of that time, they had the unpopular task of keeping boomers out of Indian Territory. One man, William Couch, was escorted back to Kansas 3 times during the winter of '83. In the spring of '84, he was trying again. A long line of wagons moved south along the Canadian, more than 1,000 settlers. This time, they meant to stay. Not far from the present-day Oklahoma City, they made camp and waited. Captain Carroll arrived with 90 tough-as-nails veterans of F and I troops and immediately got down to business. Couch was bound and tossed into a wagon. His followers could either move out under their own power, or they could be helped out. Suddenly, the command came down to fire. but the rhythmic cadence spun slowly. Some say more slowly than usual, as the sergeant watched the captain, and the captain watched the crowd. Only a heart's thunder sounded in the land. No one fired out of turn. The hasty order was countermanded seconds later. The settlers left. And Couch would finally get a street named after him in a city of his dreams. Even with all this, the Buffalo Soldiers made for themselves a reputation second to none. They fought in every major Indian war in the Southwest. They quieted the Oklahoma frontier, and in the process, won 12 Congressional Medals of Honor. Their lasting memorial is Fort Sill, which they built and still stands. With most of the white men off fighting a civil war, what little cattle raising that was done was handled by women, children, and slaves. Given responsibilities that were denied in normal times, the black men soon numbered among the most skillful cowhands on the Chisholm Trail.
Speaking about Mr. Pickett, Bill Pickett, I knew him, not intimately, but I knew him real well. However, he was grown, and I was a child. It just so happened that, as kids will do, I kind of called myself a little sweet on his granddaughter. And this enabled me to go up and be around him quite a while. Mr. Pickett had some livestock on a little acreage he was working, and occasionally they'd get out, and that would kind of irritate him. And he'd have to hunt for them at night, and the neighbors would squawk. So one day, one of his cows got out, and his wife called him and told him that the cow was gone. He had to go hunt for him. Knowing Mr. Pickett, he wasn't too good with a rope. Now, he could ride real well, better than average. But his roping left something to be desired, you know. So he chased this cow, and he couldn't get the rope on him, so seemingly through a little fit of anger, he's just going to manhandle this cow, and he rode along beside him, and he got off on him. He leaned over between his horns and bit this cow in the nose. This threw the cow off balance, and he stumbled. Cow stumbled, he's trying to hold on. He just held on with his teeth and fell on over his head. And when he hit the ground, this sudden jerk threw the cow. And to his amazement, he wanted to know if it was just a freak thing or whether it was something out of the ordinary, and he tried it again, and it worked again. So according to him and his daughter, Miss Nanny, that's how bulldogging was really originated.
Few of the white men and none of the blacks who rode the cattle trails kept accurate journals. As a rule, they wrote history with their horses and punctuated it with 6 guns. And yet, to passing references of Black Sam or simply a colored man named Charlie, it is clear that no fewer than 3,000 black cowboys passed through Oklahoma on the cattle drives to Kansas. Some of the first ranches in Oklahoma had all black cowboys.
Jake Simmons was a man believing in producing and making things come to pass. He was that kind of man.
And he was an unusual farmer. He was a great farmer and a rancher and was one of the leading ones around there. And about the first man that I know of the black people that accumulated. Most of the others had a lot of land at the time, but was allotted to them.
He is the first in that part of the country to buy those registered Hereford cattle. He was a go-getter.
How much did he accumulate? What size?
Well, about 1,000 acres.
1,000 acres, and it's still in the family, isn't it?
Yeah, it's still in the family.
That's right. Then he was helpful to other people. He raised many children aside from his own. There was always somebody in Jake Simmons' home, young man or young woman without a home. He lived that way until he died.
Bud and Ed Cox were well-known Creek citizens, freedmen, and they operated a big ranch out there 5 miles west of Wetumpka. And every summer they would have a branding festival. They'd get out and round up that cattle, and those black cowboys would go out and bring those cattle in. They have maybe 1,015 head of them at a time. Indians and colored freedmen owned all the land, and the whites didn't have a chance to get in here. All the ranching business was done by colored, and all the cowboys were colored. There weren't any whites until after statehood, when the country was opened up.
Bess Reed, I can tell you more about him than perhaps you ever heard.
The officers of the law, the chief one among us in the Indian Territory, were known as United States Marshals. They came in from the states. They were paid by the United States government. And Baz Reed came from Arkansas as one of those United States Marshals. Baz was a kind, sympathetic man, but he was a brave man, and then mentally and physically strong. He could whip most any 2 men with his fist. He was a man, when he went after a group now, brother, he'd bring you in, that's all. But he was very kind and sympathetic. He never bulged in and caused trouble. I've seen him come in the community and come to the church on Sunday, and he'd have a warrant for somebody to call him out and said, I've got a warrant for you, he said, but would you mind coming into Muskogee at the marshal office tomorrow morning? He'd tell you that nicely. He said, hey, I don't know what it is. You better go see about it. If I have to arrest you, you see, they'll take you to Fort Smith. And you'll be away from your family and everything. And he got lots of his work done just that way. His son grew up here. He married one of the native women here. And somehow or another they got into trouble and he killed her, he murdered her. Leo Bennett was the head marshal here. And he was arming his men. He got word that the boy had determined not to be arrested alive. Threatened them not to come to his house because he wasn't going to be arrested. Baz got a hold of it. Baz went to the office, Leo Bennett's office, and asked them not to go up there. Some of you will get killed.
Let me have the warrant, and I'll go up there. It's a bench warrant. And I'll do just what the warrant says. I'm going to bring him in, dead or alive. That's right. Well, the people who knew that, they colored people, they tell me a number of them followed him to the house where this young man was, begging him and insisting on it that he not do it for fear he might get killed. But he went on, Baz did, got to the house, and he yelled to this boy, his name was Benny. And now Benny said, you're no more my son. That's right. You committed a crime, and I have a warrant in my pocket for you, a bench warrant. It's either to bring you in dead or alive, and I'm going to take you in today, one way or the other. No, just that's all there is to it. You can come on out with your hands up, or else your whole body will be down. That's right. Benny came out, The people standing around hollered to him, said, "Don't raise your hands, or he'd kill you, sure." Basil said, and he gets it, and he meant to do it. And he arrested Benny and took him in. Benny went to penitentiary. We lived by the only mail route between Muskogee and Okmulgee. That was the through road going west. People came that way going to Homestead. And I was quite a small boy there, but I remember well, they passing there, and they would stop at our place to get water. Some of them camp overnight. There's a grove of trees there, and they camped there and got wood to burn, and some of them would stay there 2-3 days resting or recruiting. And I'd hear my mother talking with the women folk, and they said they were on their way to the promised land. I didn't know what that meant. They were going to Homestead, the original Oklahoma.
Oklahoma Territory. In 1892, when I first came here, why, there's 2 frame buildings here, and the rest was tents and dugouts.
Now those that had horses and cattle and stuff, why, they made it. But then now you take a person that come in here with nothing, just his bare hands, well then he had to dig this out.
Happy? Yes, sir. I was the happiest fellow you ever saw. I thought Oklahoma was the beautifulest place I ever saw in the spring. All kind of flowers come up. It was like that, you know. Yeah, I like Oklahoma, yeah.
The Reverend Paul Sykes was one of those who led people to the Promised Land. He landed with 600 ex-slaves in Kingfisher, Oklahoma Territory. The year before, lands to the west were opened. To feed his people, he preached at the Rock Island Station. He did that for years.
The old gentleman would come down here and meet the trains. There would probably in those days be 3 or 4 trains a day. He had his cane, and he was stooped a little bit. And he would start to sing. The old ox are moving, they're moving, they're moving. The old ox are moving, they're moving right along. They're going up to heaven like a feather in the air. The old ox are moving, they're moving, they're moving. The old ox are moving, they're moving right along. And that was it. That was part.
"1913 had been a bad year. Cotton prices had dropped to gut level. Farms had folded. And if you were a black man, the future held only a mirror on the times. For Oklahoma was changing. A generation before, black men had helped rule this land. Those who started in slavery became judges, marshals, mayors. One became an Indian chief. Others were cowboys, cavalry, and homesteaders. They helped carve a wilderness. statehood brought new power, and overnight, black men were told where to sit and where to walk and when to learn. For those who had come west with the frontier spirit, it was a bitter, lonely ride into the future. The people gathered in Walika as Indian summer left its colors across the land. They had heard of the man in the hills, left their farms, their tools, took only their dreams. For $25, he had said, he would take them back to Africa. It was a siren song that drew more than 1,000 people to that tiny town on the North Canadian.
Chief Sam, he sold the Negro on the idea of going back to Africa. And he would tell them such stories as over in Africa, they had trees over there that was growing flapjacks. Now, a lot of the young ones don't know what flapjacks are, but they're hotcakes. It grew flapjacks and said all you had to do was just reach up and get you a flapjack, and said they had streams of molasses running and go down and sop some molasses. And a lot of Negroes, they sold their homes and sold their farms or practically give them away.
All winter they waited. All spring. Chief Sam had gone to New York to get a boat to take them back. But with each day that passed, savings dwindled. Dysentery and typhoid ran rampant, and the situation became desperate. Finally, on June 18, 1914, the critics were silent. The SS Liberia sailed into Galveston Harbor. Oklahoma's pilgrims were on their way home. Of the thousands who bought tickets, only 60 were aboard that first voyage. But most who were left behind still believed, still had faith that next time they too would go. It took 3 months to reach the coast of Africa, and while the ship was on the high seas, the last of the faithful left the camps, this time with no money and no property. Those aboard the Liberia fared little better. They were stopped en route by a British man of war and forced to lay to for 45 days. By the time they resumed their voyage, the ship's food supplies had run out, and so had Chief Sam's money. But they made it. The Americans were well received by Sam's people, but they found the living primitive. And while there was land available, Chief Sam didn't own it, and no one else had money to buy. A few Oklahomans stayed on the Gold Coast. A few went to Liberia with Chief Sam, who later became a cocoa buyer. But most came back again to Oklahoma. Ironically, 3 years later, diamonds were discovered on the land they had sought in Africa. They had not found their dreams on the Gold Coast, nor did they find them on the return to Oklahoma, which by this time had restricted their voting, their office holding, their education, and even the areas where they could live. The frustrations of a decade found their flashpoint in Tulsa, the worst race riot in the history of the state. Most historians now agree the Holocaust was begun by a ruffian element on both sides. But riots have a way of getting out of hand. No one stops to ask who is innocent.
I sat up all night. Dr. Wickham lived right across the street from me, and they would bring the wounded there for him to dress the wounds. And then they would tear right out again, and I couldn't tell. And finally someone fell, a girl went to the door, and oh, she says, Miss Lynch, come and see the people that are in our backyard. And then it just looked like pandemonium reigned supreme.
More than 85 people were killed. Hundreds left homeless. The battle swept over Tulsa's north side for more than a day.
I lived on Elgin Street, Elgin and Haskell. And they were coming from the railroad track, which was on Cincinnati. And they didn't cross the railroad track. That was what the Negroes were trying to keep them from doing until their ammunition gave out. They didn't cross that track. But after the ammunition gave out, well then, of course, they came on across.
Tulsa's north side had been one of the most prosperous black communities in America. Now, its showcase held only rubble.
The lady that lived with me, her daughter-in-law and son lived out in the addition, what we call the addition. And we thought we'd go out there. And when we got out there, she was, the daughter-in-law had been up to her brother. She said, well, there ain't no need to stop in here. She said, because they're coming out here. I came back a few days later, my lot was as clean as this floor. I mean, there wasn't a leaf, anything on there. And I had trees and flowers, grapevines, but everything was gone. There wasn't a thing that just as clean as this floor.
The rest of the state had its share of violence, too. This was the era of the Ku Klux Klan. Night riders, lynchings, violent deaths. Parts of Oklahoma were placed under martial law, and Oklahoma's 5th governor felt it necessary to position armed guards around the Capitol to keep the legislature from meeting. John Walton was later impeached for what many felt was his excessive struggles with the Ku Klux Klan, some of whom were in that legislature. But the real struggle for civil rights did not take place in the streets. It was in the courts that black men fought and finally won back freedom. It was not an easy struggle. It would take 50 years. But the Times produced a man to lead.
Roscoe Dungy started out here as a youngster selling vegetables on the street to make a living for his family, and he saw the plight of black people in Oklahoma. Prior to the early 20s, most Negroes in Oklahoma City stayed south of 2nd Street. A shoemaker, William Floyd, bought a piece of property at Northeast 2nd at Central Street and attempted to occupy that property. But each time that he went into the property, the sheriff's officers went out there and arrested him. They arrested him 5 times in one day, and Roscoe Dungy bailed him out each time and told him to go back to his house. We got that case into the federal courts, which were then up in Guthrie rather than here in Oklahoma City. And after much adjudication, we won that case. From then, Negroes started migrating northeast till we got to 8th Street, and that's where we had some more difficulty. Of course, between Northeast 2nd and 8th, we had a few bombings. Just within a block of my office here, a colored lady by the name of Mrs. Maxwell's house was bombed because she occupied it. When we got to 8th Street, and during the tenure of Governor Bill Murray, the governor drew a line down Northeast 8th Street and said that all Negroes must stay or rent property or own property south of 8th Street, and that whites could stay anywhere north of 8th Street. Roscoe Dungy tried numerous persons who had purchased property up there to get them into court. The courts would use rather dilatory manners in that they would go out and arrest people but never bring the case to trial. Finally, we got a man, Sidney Hawkins, who was a school janitor here in Oklahoma City, who had a piece of property out on 8th Street, to agree to go all the way.
The first morning they came to arrest him, they said, they knocked on the door, and I went to the door, and they said, "Is your husband in?" And I said, "Yes." So, "Well, may we speak to him?" And I said, "Yes." And I went and called him. He's eating breakfast. And I called him, and they said, "Well, we got," he says, "Who is it?" I said, "It's the policeman." He said, "Well, what do they want?" I said, "I don't know. Come see." And he come to the door, and they told him that they were there to arrest him because he was living in an all-white neighborhood. That's all they could say to him. And they arrested him. There was a neighbor living on the east of us, and she didn't want to look over on my porch whatsoever. Well, she bought her a canvas. She went somewhere and got her, you know, one of these canvases like that to use a tent like. Well, she got one of those and put up on the west side of her porch, keeping looking on me, because I was west to her and she was east to me. When I'd wash my clothes, I'd have to go hang them on a line and sit out there until they got dry to bring them in. If it didn't, they'd throw mud all up on them. I'd come and just throw them down, pull them down, and then run. But I never did get frightened. I say if I have to die for something that will help my generation of the black people, when I'm dead and gone, it wouldn't make any difference with me. And that's the way I feel now, which I love everybody. I'd do just as much for you as I would for him. I'd nurse you just like I would him. It wouldn't make any difference with me. I'd give you just as much as I'd give him. That's what's on the inside of me. You know, on the outside don't count. The things on the inside is the thing that counts. And I'm telling you, you got to be mighty big. You got to be mighty big to say that. A woman 6, 8 years old, and I mean every word of it.
Ralph Ellison played along the broken path that was 2nd Street. As a little boy, he heard the bands on Deep Deuce. And he would grow up to write of his city and his time. What he wrote would be called the most distinguished piece of literature in the last 20 years.
My own parents, like most of the other Negro parents, had come to the new state looking for a broader freedom, and they never stopped pressing against the barriers. Now, most parents wish their children to have no contact with the cotton patch because it was part of an experience which they wanted to put behind them. It was part of the old South which they had come west to forget. But just the same, those trips to the cotton patch seemed to me an enviable experience because the kids came back with such wonderful stories. It wasn't the hard work which they stressed, but the communion, the playing, the eating and the dancing and the singing. And they brought back such good jokes, our kind of Negro jokes, not those told about Negroes by whites. And they always returned with Negro folk stories which I'd never heard before, and which I couldn't find in any of the books that I knew. I didn't think too much about it, but what my schoolmates shared in the country seemed to me to be much more real than many of the Negro middle-class values which we were being taught in school. Now, I recognized limitations, yes, but I thought these limitations were unjust, and I felt no innate sense of inferiority that would keep me from getting those things that I desired out of life. There were those who stood in the way, but despite them, you just had to keep moving toward whatever it was you wanted. As a kid, I remember working it out this way, that there was a world in which you wore your everyday clothes on Sunday, and there was a world in which you wore your Sunday clothes every day. I wanted the world in which you wore your Sunday clothes every day.
Ada Lois Scipio was wearing her Sunday best when yellow sun mixed with fog on a cold January day. It was 1946, and she was heading south into the history books.
On the appointed day, we met at the offices of the Black Dispatch, a cloudy, overcast, rather humid day, as I remember, and simply made the drive to Norman, went directly to the administration building. It was during the January enrollment, so there was quite a crowd in the hall. They were so surprised to see us come in that they sort of stood to the side, and we were able to walk immediately to the enrollment counter. Mr. Dungy had called Dr. Cross a few minutes before we came down to tell him that we would be down. So Dr. Cross was waiting and available in his office.
It would take a Philadelphia lawyer to prove to me that it costs more to run one school system than it would to run two. And one of the terrible things about segregation has been its shameful cost.
Dr. Cross then turned to Mr. Dungy and said she's qualified in every respect except that she is Negro. And under the laws of the state of Oklahoma, I will, for that reason, have to deny her admission. Mr. Dungy then asked if Dr. Cross would be willing to put his statement into her letter, which he did. I went through the district court of Cleveland County, where I lost, the state Supreme Court, where I lost, the United States Supreme Court, where I won.
Ada Lois Scipio opened the door, and millions of black youngsters across the country would follow her lead. But equal still meant separate, and it would be 6 more years before the court would change all that. In 1954, separate but equal became the same.
When we sit side by side in the same classrooms, learning the same thing at the very same time with students of all races and all nationalities, I think it will be a great step toward Christianity and brotherhood throughout the world.
Possibly at first there will be some trouble, and I agree that a lot of it will come from the parents. I don't think most of the kids would mind going to school with Negroes. I certainly wouldn't.
I feel that such a thing would have come to pass anyway, and we're finally realizing our dream.
And I believe if I had my preference, I'd rather not, but since we have to, I guess I can learn to like it.
I'd like to say that I'm very happy concerning the Supreme Court's ruling today, and I agree with the panel also. I'm sure that this will bring about a better understanding between the different racial groups, and if we realize that communism always dwells on the question that America does not provide equal educational opportunities, well, it can no longer hang on this fact, because now we will have equal opportunities.
And I think it'd be okay if they did, because there are very many fine Negro athletes, and I think if the whites and the Negroes were mixed together, they'd come up with some very fine teams.
Now, my notion is that the decision goes farther than just the question of separate schools. I think this, if the court holds that segregation is discrimination, it follows that any type of segregation, whether it be on buses or trains or in hotels or rooming houses or wherever, there has been an effort on the part of state government to make the station based on race. I think the court has outlawed that. Now, of course, we may have to go in court to implement that idea into the decisions with special cases, but I think in the end that the court is going to rule that it has made one great American family and an actual melting pot out of the people who constitute the population in the United States.
But segregation in restaurants and hotels and swimming pools was largely by custom, not law. Had it been by law, court cases could have ended it. But this time, the courts could not provide the answer. Other means were found. The tactic was the sit-in. Oklahoma City was one of the first in the country to feel its effect.
I would like to go with some facts with you. Oklahoma has always been a leader in the field of human relations. And the battlefield, the civil rights battlefield, has been fought here in Oklahoma, and we have taken more cases to the Supreme Court than any other state in the history of America. And we have been able to do it because of the fact that the whites and colors have worked together.
Freedom, freedom.
In order to bring about changes, real changes, I think we have to go back to the scripture, which teaches us plainly that a little child shall lead them. With this philosophy, then, we use children. And two, we were working through a movement, and in a movement, it's just like in the army. You've got to have people that are well trained. So if we had not had trained youth, we would have had violence, and we could not afford violence at this point in history. You cannot win with violence. And we were not only talking about winning the right to eat in a restaurant or to sleep in a hotel, but we were talking about winning a revolution where the white man, who certainly needed help in seeing what America was all about, would be in a position so after the sit-in movement, we could continue to progress, where if we had used some other tactics, we could not have progressed. I think one thing really sticks out in my memory. It's the attitude that I had toward Mrs. Johnny Brown. From 1957 to 1961, I think, I tried to see Mrs. Brown and could not. Finally, I received a call from her secretary in which I was invited to see her. And during the time, I was thinking, what could I say to this woman who more or less had my future and the future of my people in her hands and who had not done anything with it? When I arrived at the store, and especially in Mrs. Brown's office, my whole attitude toward her changed. Because standing there in the office alone, I saw her as another woman who was deeply in love with her husband, because everything in the office was just like it was before he died. And when she arrived, in place of our having any harsh things to say, we ended up in each other's arms, crying. And Mrs. Brown and I became very good friends. In 1963, my sorority honored me, and she was one of the first ones to send me an orchid and to congratulate me. She offered me an opportunity to go to Europe with her as her guest that I had to turn down because of other business. But Mrs. Johnny Brown and Clara Luper were very good friends, and I had the highest amount of respect for her. The thing that hurt me most about the sit-in movement was not the fact that I went to jail 23 times, nor the fact that once a man spit in my face and some of the other injustices that I suffered. But it was the day that I found out that Spring Lake Park was open. I was so happy because as a mother, I used to take my children by there and wanted to take them to Spring Lake Park. So when I found out it was open, I immediately contacted my daughter and said, Marilyn, I would like to take you to Spring Lake Park. At that time, Calvin was in Washington, where he had the opportunity to work for a summer. But then Marilyn looked at me and said, Mom, I want to go to Spring Lake Park, but I would rather go with some of my friends. And I realized that although I'd spent my life trying to open up Spring Lake Park, that I would never have the pleasure of taking my own children to the park. So really everything that I had done was too late. And now as I go to Spring Lake Park and as I see a mother with her children, I feel a sense of gratitude that these mothers would be able to experience what I would never experience.
somebody had told me that the times would ever be as they are now, I wouldn't have believed it. Because I thought the time would come, but I thought it would be 100, 150 years before we would have gotten where we are now. And I don't know, I just think, I sit down and think of the difference in the attitude of the races. Now, that doesn't mean that all, because there are bad people in my race just like they're bad in yours. But the majority of them, they seem to have come to the conclusion that the Negro is people.
Through the Looking Glass Darkly won a National Emmy Award in 1974. The producer, Bob Dotson. Associate producers, George Wesley, Oliver Murray, and not with us, Charles Hoff also was an associate producer. Gentlemen, how did you come up with this idea to do Through the Looking Glass Darkly?
Well, I was sent to Douglas High School. Back then we called it Black History Week, to do a story on black history. And at that time, the students there put up a great big book and opened up the pages of the book and just went back and forth on it, and some student would step out and started talking about the history of Oklahoma. There was a news story at that time, and I just mentioned it to my news director at that time, Ernie Shilks, that I think it'd be a good idea if we do something on black history. Ernie, said, yeah, okay, and sort of shrugged it off, and then about a year later, I thought it was all forgotten, and the announcement was made in the newsroom that Mr. Dotson here was going to become the head of a new department, and that would be our first project.
That was when? 1971?
That would have been 1971, 72, something like that.
Bob, when did you arrive at WKY-TV?
I arrived back when the earth was cooling. 1969, and so in those days, you remember reading about it in the history books, in the 60s, most people weren't, my age, were not interested in news per se. We wanted to do documentaries because we had the true religion and we wanted to tell people about it. And I came from Syracuse University back east in New York State because Channel 4 had a long history of doing documentaries up to that point. And I remember Ernie Schultz, the news director, came to me and said, I think we ought to start something on Sunday morning, kind of a swivel chair talk show where you could talk to black preachers, about anything in the community, because of course in those days we had no black reporters. Oliver, I think we were the only guy on staff at that moment.
Right.
So at any rate, I said, well, wait a minute, why don't we do something more? We've got these great historical documentaries, why don't we do something on black history? So I said, let me run it past, and when he came back, he said, I got an idea for you. You can be special projects director, and it'll be a title in lieu of a raise. And I had just gotten married. That's the reason why I know when we started it, because when I got back from the honeymoon, I didn't have a weekend off for a whole year, because that's when, I still had to do the news stuff as well. And they would give us like 6 minutes of film a day that when we had a chance to go out and do something. And we would go into people's homes and we'd do the old Greyhound routine. You sit next to somebody long enough and they'd go, well, let me tell you about my brother-in-law. Well, and because you're a stranger and they don't know you, they'll tell you. And once in a while they would come around to something that would be of real significance, and then Oliver and I'd kind of wink at each other, and I'd try to work them back around, because the average age of the people in the first hour of the Looking Glass, I believe, was between 85 and 95. And we had to find, a lot of it was the detective work, of finding somebody that had had some history, but also could remember it,
right,
and could talk about it.
George, when did you get involved?
It was 73, actually. I made the commitment to come at I think about November of 72, but at the time I was teaching at Grambling College and building a radio station. So I wanted to complete that, and in between time, during breaks, I would come and, you know, watch what they were doing.
You're talking about your schedule, Bob. How much time did you all devote to this project?
Oh, gosh, I think I was full-time on it for 18 months. But it was a 90-minute documentary. The original idea was to do the easy thing, because in those days, people, when they thought about black history, thought about political history, civil rights, because we were deep into that struggle at the moment. But I had an idea that I said, why don't we go back to the beginning? Because you know, being from outside Oklahoma, which I think was a plus, because I was curious. And then to find out that they had 28 all-black towns and that they had black marshals and mayors and, you know, all the things we know today.
Well, we'd have to fight for, to a certain extent, to get out and shoot, because both of us was covering the news. I was a news photographer and Bob was a reporter, and we worked side by side doing day-by-day news. So he would make phone calls and line things up, and we would go in and come in on our days off or whatever we can catch and go out and stay shooting for an hour or so, or maybe one whole day. And that would be very, very rare to get one whole day, because the main project at the station was the news.
We'd check out funerals. We really did. In fact, one of the sequences that you'll see in the show, one of the classic sequences, were 3 old men in a beautiful spring day sitting under a dogwood tree swapping stories. And then Oliver and I kind of just sidled up to them, and the next thing we know, we heard about Baz Reeves, who was the first black federal marshal. And all this stuff that we'd never heard of, because there was a judge, for instance, over in northeastern Oklahoma, who was the reason that many black families around Muskogee ended up with more land. And it's a great story, and you'll see it in the show if you haven't seen it already. And all of that happened because we just kind of hung out at a funeral. And that's the best way of doing this kind of journalism, because, you know, these people don't send out resumes, and they don't send out press releases. These are folks who just generally, when you walk up to them, say, well, why are you here? I'm nothing special. Yeah. And then that's when we grin and walk right in, because they do have things that are special.
So and one of the things about that is that you would talk to people about, well, can you tell us something about the early days? And, well, no. So do you know anybody who was of any significance? And not really. And I remember we were at the old calligrapher's house, and we were leaving, and there were some photographs there. And they said, well, who is that? I said, oh, that's so-and-so, and he was a marshal over in Fort Smith. You know, because they think of them as Uncle Joe or Uncle Fred or whoever, and once they get talking, like Bob said, then you get a wealth of information.
This was like a big scavenger hunt. I mean, really, it was like an 18-month scavenger hunt, because somebody would have a photograph like that, but no memory of what the photograph was about. And then you'd walk around with it kind of like a sandwich board, you know, like, did you see that? And the guy go, that's Baz Reeves.
Right.
And then boom, they'd tell you the story about it, and you put the two of them together.
Was there anyone in particular that was the most helpful, that gave you more direction than anybody else? Did you know people in the community that helped out?
I'll tell you, the person who helped us the most, and he was already dead, was a fellow by the name of Benny Kent. And Benny Kent was a Pathé newsreel photographer from 1906 until his death in 1946. And he would go out and shoot stories that would send to New York City for the newsreels. But because he was a storyteller at heart, he would shoot stuff that he knew he couldn't sell. Black history, a Native American history where they weren't wearing feathers, but doing something regular. Women's history, but besides women who were in swimsuits, because that was the stuff that would sell in those days. But he shot it on old nitrate-based film, which was highly explosive. And so he kept that in the ceiling of the fire station up in Stillwater, because he figured if it blew up, it'd be close to the hoses. Right. And when they were, about this time we were starting it, you know, they were tearing down the fire station, and they'd found this great cache. And I didn't find it, but the firemen did. And they went to the people who were there just before all of us came, and they had convinced them to get a bunch of footage transferred, whatever they could save. Well, we had a place in old Channel 4 between the ceiling of the newsroom and the roof of the building, which we called the land of the midgets. Land of the midgets, because you could not stand up. But that's where, at the end of every newscast, you'd coil up your film and you'd just kind of throw it in there, right? So I went up there when we were thinking about starting this, and I found this old Benny Kent footage. You know, it had things like Geronimo's last buffalo hunt up at the 101 Ranch, things like that. But it also had various films from Black history. So I started carting that around and showing people and saying, listen, well, that got people interested. You know, because they did, first of all, in those days, they didn't think that anybody cared about their history, and there wasn't much that had been written down at that point.
A lot of them really didn't think of it as being history. To them, they were just living, trying to scratch and make it on a day-by-day basis, you know. I mean, you go out and talk to somebody about coming to Oklahoma and living in a dugout for a couple of 2 or 3 years while they built their house. To them, that was just living, you know. Black cowboys, they were just doing their job, trying to survive on a day-by-day basis until Dotson and George and myself got a chance to stand out and talk to people. And I guess it's like what we're going through right now. Our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will say, well, this is history that we're living right now. So basically, until someone actually started telling the story of the past, no one looks at it as a history.
How much source material was available in libraries and various places?
Well, I went out to Langston University and I said, what do you got on Black history in Oklahoma? And the librarian said, well, we got a lot of the Harlem Renaissance. And I was a kid, and I said, well, Harlem, that's New York City, right? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, what do you got in Oklahoma? And he said, nothing. In the schools, in the public schools in Oklahoma City, I can't remember the lady's name, but they had just written a textbook, and that was like, it was like a workbook, basically. And that was the only thing we had. But it gave us a little time frame, you know. But beyond that, it was mostly it was in their closets, it was in their bedrooms, it was in their heads. And so we, you know, fortunately.
We had to beg for the pictures.
Had to beg for the pictures.
We had to literally promise them we would get their pictures back to them, and after we got through with them, we personally went back and carried their pictures and handed them back to us, because we had their life, their treasures.
Right. George, why wasn't there a better record kept during that period of time? Great history.
Well, there were probably records that were kept, but they were not seen, I guess, as significant in the mainstream libraries and that sort of thing. And that's why the digging is so great. You know, you just had to go to wherever you could and put it together. But as far as a chronicle, I guess the closest maybe would have been the Black Dispatch that had been around for a good while. I mean, if you went through their volumes.
But you remember, though, they'd had a fire. And so, or maybe it was before you came, but they had a fire, so they didn't have any archives. That's why we went to Langston. And but you see, also, I think that's why the program has had such an impact over the years, because it was a gee whiz all the way through it. Like, well, gee, I didn't know that. You know, even people who had lived it didn't, because they hadn't talked to their grandparents yet, so they didn't know about it, the younger people. And so that's why it had such a boom in your face, because in The Looking Glass, it wasn't a political piece. It was just people telling a story. And you know, stories only happen to people who are allowed to tell them.
You know, like, I think what a lot of people don't understand is the title of The Looking Glass and what it really means. And that's why Dotson came up with this title, is because we were invisible. And that's the way we lived. We were there, but to the average person, we were just invisible. And that's why it comes to The Looking Glass Darkly. And Dotson was the one to come up with this, with the title of the story in the first place. You know,
in the production of this, you shot film. How did that limit you, what you were able to do, or direct how you had to do it?
Well, a lot of things were real dark.
We're laughing because, you know, film was gold. I mean, we take I had to take a 25-foot of film, and if I didn't come back with at least 3 stirs on that roll of film, you know, my news director had me in front of his desk as a waste. I mean, you learn how to shoot, and every shot had to count. I mean, what we threw on the floor was about a little strip about like this here.
You edited in the camera.
You had to learn how to edit in the camera. There was no shooting. Even news stories, you edit in the camera. And
how much would 200 feet be?
Oh, it would be about 6 minutes.
All right, so you didn't have much to waste at all.
No.
How did you get those stories on film? Because obviously people might take forever to tell a story. When did you know how to do that properly?
Well, I learned during the process of this that people always answer your questions in threes, which I will do as well. They answer the question they think you've asked, and then secondly, they explain their answer. And if you wait just a beat, because people hate silence, they'll go, well, dummy, that's why I killed my wife, which is the sound that you want. I mean, you want them to crystallize their thought and just get to it. And so that's what we would do. We wouldn't roll the film camera until after we got close to the number 3.
Right.
It's sort of like yeah, it's like a sports
signal. Yeah. Sometimes we'd be sitting there focused up, and you have to focus on 3 different people, but you stay wide. And once Dotson give me the signal, whatever the signal is going to be, he'll call that person's name. So all I had to do was just pan it over, tighten up. Boom, it's there.
It also helps you to say, huh. Because, you know, they'll tell you, you know, this is really wonderful, and then it's all done, and you know the camera's not rolling, you go, huh?
Huh?
To get them to repeat it.
To repeat it the same way, because if you don't, they'll say, like I said before, and they never say it like they said it before, because it's like a joke. Second time doesn't have the emphasis, doesn't have the timing. And so it became, I mean, obviously I went to school on it. It's lasted me 30 years since. I mean, be able to find the sound that actually crystallizes what the person wants to say and be rolling when it happens.
Did you have a favorite character that you met?
I have 2.
Who?
And I'm sorry I can't remember their names, but the very first opening shot.
Charles Ellison. He was sitting out in a field of daisies. He was pushing 100.
About 98, and just had a son,
Yeah.
6 years old.
6 years old. And he had been out literally plowing with a mule. And then we wandered up this hill. It was late in the afternoon, beautiful light, and he sits down, and we got to talking to him, and he said, you know, I'm one of the last of the sacred harp singers around here. And this is one of the very first things we shot.
The very first
and so he pulls out this old hymnal, and sacred harp singing is singing a cappella with no accompaniment. He had perfect pitch. He starts singing, and he goes through a phrase, camera's rolling, a shadow comes across the sun, and he goes, you can't read it. And he goes, that's it. My eyes are about gone. I'm old, too old.
Can't do it no more.
But I can't, you know, that's important, but I can't do it no more. And that, of course, became the closing. And the opening was the same thing. We set it up with him going into his field of daisies, you know. But his name was Charles Ellison, and he was one of my favorites. The other guy that I loved was an old man who was out in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, who was in his 80s, and he was holding court at the end of this cafe, and he was telling this story about a man by the name of Paul Sykes. And I'm not going to give it all away, because if you haven't seen the show, watch it on a rerun. And I don't know whether this runs before or after. But at any rate, this old guy had told that story, obviously, so many times in the coffee shop that nobody wanted to listen to it anymore.
Yeah.
But I was 23 or something, you know, so I thought, well, I never heard it, you know. And it turns out that he had absorbed this great history about a man who had basically saved Kingfisher. Kingfisher probably wouldn't be there today if it hadn't been for Paul Sykes. This is a great tease to watch the show, or what? And then now the thing was, he was as old as the man he'd been talking about. So Oliver came out the next time, and the old man put on a coat and went out to the railroad station where the fellow he was telling about in the story used to go out and sing to the passing trains, and he sang the same song. And we waited till a freight train came by, and then we would dissolve back and forth from the picture of Paul Sykes and the old railroads at the time. And that's how we would tell these stories, by not passing up people who had good stories to tell and having a little patience. And this one thing in our business we seldom have is patience. That's why we always go after the people with the sound bites, you know, the elected officials who know how to give you 20 seconds real fast. But other people have these great stories to tell, and if you can just play the Greyhound bus, you know, and sit next to them a little bit, they'll tell you things that'll last a lifetime.
George, do you have a favorite?
Probably several, but I keep thinking about the little old lady who was talking about earlier days. Was it the riots?
Birdie Farmer. Birdie Farmer.
Birdie Farmer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
She was in what do they call that riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Right.
Yeah.
And she was a school teacher back then, and she moved here.
And she also was at the
Courthouse.
convention. She was at the convention, the very first state convention, which and watched the governor being elected. And then she was like a clerk typist or something.
Her husband worked
Yeah.
there.
And she said, you know what's the first thing that the legislature passed, or discussed at least, was whether or not we were people.
Yes.
And she says, I was invisible sitting there. She said, but I heard him. I heard him. You know.
Yes. Yes.
And that was in the second one, you know, when we started getting into this. In fact, the second part of the Looking Glass is called The Struggle for Civil Rights.
Total of 90 minutes.
90 minutes.
Right. Total of 90 minutes. One thing that I think is striking about Through the Looking Glass Darkly is that you don't talk very much. You're a storyteller, but you let the people tell the story. Did you think at the very beginning that that was going to be the way it would work out?
Well, our first boss pounded into our head that journalists were interesting, but they were not nearly as interesting as the stories they covered.
That's right.
And that sounds so archaic today because, I mean, we're all into personality journalism now, you know. How does it affect me as the journalist? But in those days, I mean, who was I? I was a 20-something kid from St. Louis.
There was no stand-ups.
Yeah, I mean, why? I mean, if I could find the right number of people to put into the story that were interesting and articulate and had a good story to tell, and you could keep the pace up, then I figured I could live a long and happy life in journalism. And so that's why I did it. I just said, you know, let's put a few lines of copy and let them talk. And we had the great pictures that Oliver and all was found.
You got Ralph Ellison?
Yeah. The Invisible Man.
How did you find him?
Well, he was easy to find. It was hard to get because he was expensive. He lived in New York City, and he wasn't planning to come out to Oklahoma City anytime soon, and we didn't have any money. And we couldn't afford to get a camera crew in New York City to go talk to him. So I think we hired an audio guy to go over and set up in his living room, and I sent him a list of questions, and he was very gracious, and he talked about it. And he was the author of a book called The Invisible Man, which is exactly what the theme of this story was anyway. And so we sent him the questions about that and about Charlie Parker, right?
Right.
The great jazz musician. And then we were able to put some of that, excuse me, Charlie Christian.
Charlie Christian.
And so we were able to put some of that into the story too.
Was there anybody that you wanted to talk to that you didn't get a chance to talk to?
I don't think so. I think it worked the other way around.
Right.
We were just thrilled to get who we got.
Get who we got. You know, we, like in the second half, that was a lot easier half to do because most of those people I grew up with, they was either my school teacher, we lived in the same community, I've known them all my life. So the second half was not that hard to do. I mean, talking to people like Jimmy Stewart, Melvin Porter, Clara Luper, those people was in the community and very active at that time. It was that first half that was sort of hard to get, but if we listen and we listen hard enough, they was telling us about something that took place. And our job was to go out and to make sure that it was authentic by doing the research on it, which she's being modest about. I mean, a lot of this is checking and double checking, checking the dates, checking the day a person's birth certificate have on it, going to a newspaper and making sure that these things that we're talking about is authentic more than anything else, because we didn't want to have anybody coming back challenging us on these stories. So we, you know, had to do a lot of legwork. And in the process of doing the legwork, we could be somewhere and they said, well, have you met so-and-so and so-and-so? He knew Bill Pickens as a personal friend. And we go to his house and started talking to him, and, you know, he would sit up there and tell us about Bill. Well, I didn't know him personally, but I used to go with his daughter, you know. So,
the great cowboy.
The great cowboy. And how Bill Pickett discovered bulldogging. I mean, it's just one of those, you know, just beating the paper.
Charlie Christian's brother.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, like I say, it was a real detective's job, which was part of the fun of it, was the curiosity of going from house to house.
You didn't have much in the way of graphics. You look back now and you see that the graphics were fairly rudimentary.
Yeah.
Fair?
Yeah. We would have used hand puppets if we had them.
That had to be a challenge. Ken Burns, a more modern documentary filmmaker, can use graphics from time to time very effectively, but you didn't have too much to work with there.
No. But we had the cast. We had the people with the really terrific stories to tell. And if you've got that, if you can hold them with that, the rest of it's all icing on the cake. You know, you can get better or worse, but basically it's the stories.
And they're telling it in their way, so it's much more sincere than somebody else trying to say, Miss So-and-so did this and did that. But, you know, you remember the little old lady who talked about Oklahoma and how long she'd been here?
Came in on the run of 89 or 93 or something.
And then she said she had false teeth. And she said, I don't like Oklahoma yet. You know, things like that you can't orchestrate.
Yeah, she was grabbing for her teeth as she was saying it. And we closed one of the half hours with that.
Yeah.
But it was a great challenge because we had to put it together much like a movie. We had to have a beginning and an end and a chapter, and we had to bring it up to a certain level each time. It wasn't just, as you'll see, it isn't just a string of reminiscences from older people. We had to put pacing, and we had to find, sometimes we would take old films and throw them down on the floor and walk on them a while to make it look old, like they were Hollywood films, and then we would layer that over the pictures we wanted them to pay attention to. But you know, today you would take your laptop and your graphics machine and do that in 10 seconds, and we were literally doing anything we could to bring some style and graphics to the stories. And like I say, earlier, Benny Kent's footage, the old Pathé newsreel, helped us a bunch because at least we had some things that moved. Because you can't do an hour and a half with still pictures and old people. I mean,
and music played an integral role in the program, and I'm sure that didn't just happen by accident either. That had to take some time.
No, actually, I wrote both shows listening to the music because I often found that you don't have a lot of time to write. I mean, you have plenty of time to write, but you don't have a lot of time to put it in the story. It has to run, 6 seconds or 5 seconds. So I'd have to write it kind of like a line of poetry. So I would get, my wife worked, Linda, in those days it was Linda Puckett, and we'd just gotten married, Linda Dotson, and she worked on the radio side, and we got all these albums that didn't fit the rock and roll format, but they were neat because it would be like Quincy Jones in a failed movie. So no one would remember the movie, the music would be new. The trick with music is not to get some song that everybody recognizes, because then they stop listening to you and they remember, you remember when we had that date and we loved that song? So, but if you can get a recording from Quincy Jones in a failed movie so that no one remembers the recording, you got great music. And so I would listen to it over and over again as I would sit there and type that part of the script, so that the words would fit the music, and the music would fit my mood, and the mood, of course, would be spawned by what we had just heard or whatever,
And post-production was, imagine a studio twice as big as this one, with pictures from the wall to the ceiling, and music playing in the background, and all of us thinking about what shot we're going to put where, what beat we're going to end with, or what picture, and it's just one of those things with, just talking about it and seeing how it's going to fit, and everybody sort of doing their own thing, and it sort of fell together.
We were part of the wood-burning TV era.
So did you mesh? Did you have some creative conflict?
No.
Or did you know where you were going and you were on the same page?
We didn't know where we were going.
That was
It just happened.
Right.
I mean, if we had a leader, it would be Bob. Yeah. And the rest of it just sort of fell together. It wasn't a power struggle. We were doing the best we could possibly do to help each other.
Well, the neat thing about doing a story like this is it's like playing in a jazz ensemble. You're riffing all the time because you don't know where it's going. But the fun of it is the riff. And then you step back and, good creativity comes from not caring who gets the credit, because that way everybody feels, empowered to step forward. They don't think, oh my God, if I say this, he's going to hate it because it's not his idea or my idea, whatever. That'll kill it. Because what happens is, like with a good jazz ensemble, when all the players are just having a lot of fun, you come up with something better than individually you could ever do. And in this case, we knew we had a powerful story. We finally ended up with some really good people. So when we sat down into post-production to put it all together, we just went with what worked, which is the hardest thing to find out. It's like asking a sculptor, well, how do you know that's in there, Right. Well, you throw away everything that doesn't fit, Well, how do you know? Well, I don't know. That's the hard part. But basically, that was it. We had the good building blocks to start with.
So how long did the shooting actually take?
I don't know, about 6 months maybe.
Yeah, over at least over 6, 7 months. And it was, like I said, it was not a day-by-day thing. It was like once every 2 or 3 weeks we might get a chance to go out and devote a day or devote an hour. Sometimes we couldn't get these people until they got off of the regular jobs at night, so we had to go to their house and be there at 7 o'clock at night and started setting up and keep them up, and a lot of them would not let you stay beyond 9.
Right.
So we get set up, they let us in early, we set up the lights, and like Bob said, we talked to them for a while with the lights up so they can get used to it, and they'd ignore the camera. I wouldn't stand behind the camera a lot, but after we've heard the story, we had an idea, and he gave me the signal, and once I got the signal, I saw the ease over behind the camera, and he, you told me something about a couple of minutes ago. What was that you were saying? And
right.
It'll go.
Then how long did the post-production take?
A lifetime. Oh, I think I locked myself into a bedroom at my house and went about 2 days and wrote the first show. And all I had in there was all these, pieces of paper all over the damn wall.
You should see the pieces. Big as my thumb. Some of the paper he would come in with sometimes was about the size of my thumb, and it'd just be pasted all over the wall and everything.
And my wife would, throw a pizza under the door, but that would be it, because you have to, when you have something like this that spans from 1830 to 1907, and all the people you've met, and the biggest problem, of course, is you fall in love with certain things, because you climb to this top of this mountain, you're going to jam that in, and that may take you all day to realize, well, you climbed to the top of the mountain, but it doesn't fit. So don't put it in, because you're killing it, And so what I did was I just walled myself off and at least got the script done. And then from there, the biggest problem then at that point was to make it come alive and figure out how to do the film and the sound effects and the music and all that. But that was the fun part at that point. Once we figured out how this story goes where it goes, and we were fortunate we already had the bookends. We knew we were going to start with the old guy out in the field, and we were going to end with the shadow coming across the cloud, or the cloud coming across the sun. So once we had that in our mind, the rest of it was just okay.
George, as you saw this coming together, when did you think that this might be really something special?
I don't, when you say really special, like maybe winning an Emmy,
right.
I didn't think that. But I thought it's a very important piece about black history in Oklahoma. Because I was learning too, because I came, I'm not a native Oklahoman like Oliver, so I came here from Louisiana, but a native Arkansan. And so as I looked at it, I was learning a lot about Oklahoma, like Fort Sill. Never crossed my mind that black soldiers had anything to do with Fort Sill, but they built it.
The key to doing this kind of story is not to set out to do a history. Just do a story, storytelling. Because if you put that little mantle of history on it, people go, oh, Jesus, sort of like I have to go to church here and they're going to preach to me for an hour. So what I did was I made sure that the people and the sound bites that we had would come across as ordinary, interesting people. And then I would set up each response in the story so that they kind of teased you with what was going to happen. Like, for instance, we had the last of he was talking about Fort Sill, we had the last of the Buffalo soldiers' wives. All the Buffalo soldiers were dead, but this wife was still alive. And so we teased her a little bit in the story in terms of how she was going to tell her story. But she said, you know what my husband said to his dying day about being a Buffalo soldier? Nope. He said, well, he says, the best thing was that George Armstrong Custer was offered to be the leader of the Buffalo soldiers. And he said, I wouldn't lead those guys anywhere. And she said, my husband would always grin, and he said, we went to Fort Sill, he went to the Little Bighorn.
A faithful decision for him.
Right, So those kinds of stories, what I wanted was, I didn't want to preach to the people who would normally tune in, like 3 history teachers and 2 85-year-old black Oklahomans, go, yes, I love that story. I wanted to get the people who didn't care, and hopefully they would be in it 20 minutes before they realized they were having fun watching this thing. So it's like Bill Cosby's humor at his best in the 1980s. He could tell a joke that would make a 4-year-old giggle and an 80-year-old giggle because he touched all the universal buttons. And that's why I wanted to present these people, and Oliver did too, and George. We wanted to present them, first of all, as engaging human beings with a terrific story and suck everybody into it, before, like you do. You know, you get to a movie or something like that, and you don't, I'm not going to like this, and then you're into it because it's really good theater as well.
I don't believe that we actually knew that we had something great. We were just doing something that we enjoyed doing. I enjoyed being a cinema photographer. Bob and George here, they enjoyed writing and producing. And yes, I'm from Oklahoma, and you know, I hear the stories that my grandfather was telling me about coming in on a covered wagon as a little boy and all this here, but again, they're just stories. And as far as having something great here, I never thought about it from that standpoint of view. It's just something that just kind of happened.
How was Through the Looking Glass Darkly accepted in the black community?
Well, I would venture to say at that time, when arms was open wide. Again, did we do any advertising? This was a Black History show the first time we ran this? I don't remember. I think we just said it was going to do it. It was a documentary.
No, we said it was a history of black Oklahoma. Yeah, absolutely. We had a picture of Peril Bruner, and it ran on all the ads and stuff. Yeah.
But and I imagine the whole community maybe could have tuned in at that particular time. But the second time, I know everybody tuned in on it, because it was a difference in going to the grocery store and somebody saying, you know, and at that time we did something quite similar to what we're doing now on that second time that it ran, and that's, people got a chance to see the people to put it together. So in grocery stores, people hollering at you and things like it's here, you know.
And obviously it won an Emmy Award. That was a momentous time, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was an evening. Some of you may recall this. You remember President Nixon, who told the world that he was not a crook, and Dan Rather had a big fight with him, his first. That was at that award ceremony that night, which happened to be in Houston, and I was there. The station said, well, you know, if you can get there, we'll be glad to find you a seat. There wasn't a whole lot of money because we didn't think we were going to win. And you know what, we were in Oklahoma City, you know. We were up against Geraldo Rivera, who at the time was working at the ABC station in New York, and there was another documentary from WRC in Washington, D.C., the big NBC affiliate, and then there was Oklahoma. At any rate, so we're down there, and it was the first night of a young correspondent who had just gotten the White House beat. You might recall, some of your viewers, his name is Tom Brokaw. So Brokaw said, wow, that's really wonderful. You're from Oklahoma, you know, I've been there a couple times, you know. And he said, did you think it was terrible what Dan said to the president? And you may recall, some of you who maybe old enough to remember it or read about it in your history book, but Dan Rather asked a very pointed question to President Nixon. It was all during Watergate. And so Nixon said, what are you running for, Dan? And instead of saying nothing, Dan mouthed off at him. He said, I don't know, what are you running for? Something like that. Well, everybody goes, oh, you know. So that was all there. And then in the midst of all that, they said, oh, and by the way, Oklahoma City just won this Emmy. So nobody remembered it except for people in Oklahoma. We were like in a 4-foot hover, but everybody else was, the next day was like, oh my God, Dan Rather, you know, was yelling at the president. You know, and so it was quite a thing. It went on. Besides that, everybody remembers the Emmys, but it won a DuPont Columbia Award, which in many ways is as big. Robert F. Kennedy, who had just been assassinated just a few years before, they had an award that they established only 3 years prior to that, and it won the grand prize of the Robert F. Kennedy Award. And then it ran in the Smithsonian in the screening room for about 6 weeks after that. So I mean, this thing took off. But basically it was because, I think, we had people telling stories that nobody at that time had ever told on television. I mean, if you were a big name black artist, you might have been on TV or a writer and all that. But ordinary people, this is like 10 years before Ken Burns, but ordinary people telling a story, it goes right through the screen, and other ordinary people can relate to that, regardless of their color or background. And I think that's why it took off.
Well done, gentlemen. Thank you for doing the project. Congratulations again on the Emmy.
Thanks.
Many years later. Bob Dotson, George Wesley, Oliver Murray, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.